Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Reclaim Network Plus webinar series. My name is Prashant Kumar, so I'm professor and chair in air quality and health, and also the principal investigator for the Reclaim Network. So just to go before in detail, there are a few housekeeping notes. So this webinar will be recorded, so that it can be made available via our Reclaim Network YouTube channel. You can ask your questions, and please use the Q&A box, which you can see on your screen. And these questions will be picked up towards the end. So we've got two speakers today, so you will hear one by one from them. So once they finish, then we will pick up those questions. And my colleague Thomas on the call, he will chair that particular session. Apart from that, we have you can possibly keep your mics on the mute. So these are a couple of things in there just to talk about this the Reclaim webinar series. So this will be like 18 webinars. So they will be starting today, and they are usually every month. We have picked up a time on Wednesday between 12:30 to 3:30 hours, but it might be the case that some of them may not happen because of the holidays and all. You can see in the chat box there is a link where the schedules for the upcoming webinars are, which will be updated. So each of these webinars usually will have 3 speakers, and each speaker will be talking about the 20 minutes. So we are trying to get these speakers from the academic and the non-academic background, so you can hear more on the diversity. So the overall goal of these webinars are to share the best practices and facilitate knowledge exchange between practitioners, researchers, policymakers, businesses, environmental groups, charities, and individuals interested in implementation of green infrastructure. So the whole idea is to look at the urban environment from a the systems perspective, so more holistically, to make them these living spaces more healthy, sustainable, and resilient. So before further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Tijana Blanusa. She leads and delivers the RHS research on the environmental benefits of gardens and urban green infrastructure. She's particularly interested in the contribution of plants to urban cooling, rainfall mitigation, and air quality improvements. And she's working to understand what underlying plant traits are most successful at this, so that these plants can be harnessed to deliver the multiple benefits. So over to you, Dr. Blanusa.
Thank you, Prashant, for that introduction. Indeed, I will be spending quite a lot of time talking about these traits, which we biologists are interested in and think may have some relevance in the practical context in the urban environment. So I will share my screen in a moment. I think I have sort of gone slightly big here, saying I'm giving an update on the RHS environmental science research. In reality, I will really just be giving you partial update on some of the work that I thought might be relevant for this audience, and that's closest to the work that I am doing, so I can also answer some questions about it later. So I suppose a lot of you would be aware of Royal Horticultural Society as a gardening charity. It's the biggest UK gardening organization. We have over 600,000 members. Some of you who live nearby may have even gone and visited RHS Garden Weasley or been to one of our flower shows. I'm putting a shameless plug here for our next flower show at Hampton Court in July. We've also sort of branched out more north. Last year, we have opened a garden in Bridgewater, just outside of Manchester. But I suppose fewer number of you will be aware that RHS also does science. It is applied horticultural science, and we've been doing that for decades now, really, but are a rapidly growing team, and I'm one of those people in the RHS science team. Last year, our new science center has opened at the RHS Hilltop. So those of you that are able to visit Wisley, please, come and see us. There are publicly accessible bits, but there's also our labs and working spaces, which are in this lovely new building that we have. So in terms of the wider team, I'm one of the 9 team members in a team that's called Environmental Horticulture within RHS Science. And we are looking at sustainable interaction between soils, plants, water, and people in the gardens. So among us, the scientists within the team, we have divided our interests in those of us who work on plants and how they interact with, take up carbon dioxide, exchange water with the environment, how that affects the microclimate around them. We have a colleague who's a soil scientist who's very much interested in the soil interactions. And then we have a couple of colleagues who have joined us in the last couple of years who work on people's interactions with gardens, and then how the gardens make us feel and how do we garden more sustainably. I'm a plant scientist myself. I'm a plant physiologist. So my talk will be predominantly around plant traits which can be linked to better delivery of regulating ecosystem services. So over the past 10 years or so, I have worked with a number of, I've supervised a number of PhD projects and also had a few postdoctoral projects that I've sort of mentored, as it were, and those focus largely on different forms of green infrastructure and cooling, different forms of green infrastructure and rainfall capture, and then also pollutant trapping, but focusing on particles, PM pollution, with very small excursions, as it were, into the gaseous, understanding the plant's role in absorbing gaseous pollution. And these were all individual projects which focused on just one aspect of how plants deliver it. Obviously, plants would be delivering simultaneous multiple benefits and also posing some challenges. But in those individual projects, we've been able to identify the underlying traits which we found could be linked to better delivery, say, here in cooling. So the plants that we found cool well, and here on the left is an example of the plants in a green roof context, which we've used. So, different color plants, different leaf thicknesses, presence or absence of hairs, different transpiration rates, so different physiological characteristics and structural characteristics of those plants. And we kind of have found that high leaf transpiration rate, so how thirsty is a plant for general audience, what the color of the leaf is, the presence of the hairs would influence how well it cools. And then we also found that light colors, presence of hairs, high transpiration rates, and large leaf areas can all be correlated with better cooling. And here below, for those of you who will be maybe going over the presentation later, I have put in the links to papers where this is discussed in a lot more detail. And then for rainfall capture, we have done the same. Again, we want thirsty plants with large leaf areas, rough leaf surfaces, presence of hair for better canopy storage of rainfall. For pollutants, again, larger leaf areas, presence of hairs and rough surfaces. I mean, there are lots of ifs and buts and nuances and details, but, strictly biologically speaking, these are characteristics which lend plants the possibility to provide a good range of environmental services. So more recently, over the last 3 or 4 years, I have been using, and some of my students have been using hedges as a model, and that's where Prashant's group and our group have also well, loosely, I would say, collaborated and you know, exchanged information and interests. We have tested a broad range of hedge species and cultivars, which is, you know, RHS specialism, you know, looking at sort of botanically slightly more detail, deciduous and evergreen, and trying to figure out to what extent is this difference in plant structure and function that can be found in the, you know, botanical biological world relevant for practical application of you know, increasing rainfall capture, increasing particle pollutant capture, and reducing noise. Again, here I have listed a few papers where, you know, which we've already published on that particular topic. The reason why we have chosen hedges is because we know from some informal RHS surveys on YouGov and such like that majority of RHS members and generally British public have hedges around their gardens. They are a prevalent form of green infrastructure in the British urban landscape. They're cheap and easy to install and relatively easy to maintain. And we thought, let's see how by maybe choosing cleverly, we can maximize what those hedges can do and also minimize any negative impacts. So we've, as you do in science, we've started with a review paper, but that review paper is summarized in this RHS web page. So don't despair just looking at this much text in my slide. It's again more for those of you who want to look at it later. But we have looked at the literature and tried to identify which particular traits are present if we want a hedge to be good at particulate capture, at noise reduction, rainfall attenuation, you know, providing habitat for wildlife, and then also identified examples from the literature where that was studied, which could be used as starting points of species that could be recommended in the urban areas. We found that for, you know, noise reduction, wide, tall, and multi-stratified vegetation belts with evergreen species and dense canopies provide relatively good service. And on the right are examples of some such species. That is by no means an exhaustive list or a prescription or a suggestion that our urban areas should become completely uniform and that we should be only using taxus if we wanted to combat noise. But it gives some indication of what could be the carrying species with certain favorable traits. Obviously, we all get very excited about the positive things that plants can do, but we need to be in our green infrastructure installations. We also need to be mindful of the possible pitfalls and challenges, and they, in our mind, largely rely around allergenicity of some species. I mean, here I've listed some common culprits that are quite widely used, but could be put to better use through a well thought through management, which would reduce the pollen levels. Invasiveness clearly is an issue in some contexts and needs to be borne in mind when designing and planning green spaces. And then, even though it's not specifically a disservice, but intensive management with all the inbuilt carbon costs, you know, frequent pruning, trimming, application of pesticides to keep some species going is something that we need to be aware of and think about when we are planning our green spaces. Now, back to the research. So in terms of the actual research that we have done within our group and that has been already published, I've summarized here some main take-home messages which might be of interest to the viewers of this talk. So our conclusions come from number of years of study in the glasshouse field and in situ street experiments on 8 hedge species. And the way we've chosen them is to represent a range of characteristics which we thought would be favorable. So evergreen and deciduous, broadleaf and coniferous, and you know, just to give you some idea. And then basically, we found that plants with large canopies and small leaves mitigate rainfall even when substrate is saturated. So even when you have no capacity in the soil to take any further rainfall, large canopies and small leaves kind of taken together help. Delay of rainfall runoff when hedges are used can be significant, and plants with higher transpiration rate provide better rainfall attenuation because of their capacity to increase soil storage capacity. And then when we looked in the street level situations, this particulate matter capture on hedges seemed to have been important in locations with high traffic intensity rather than in locations where the location, so plant choice was very important there, but and plants were performing quite differently, but in the areas with lower traffic levels, then the species choice was less important. And then I wanted to mention a work which we have started over the last couple of years with a new colleague, Dr. Elizabeth Larsen, who is RHS tree research fellow and funded by the RHS, and Frank P. Matthews, one of the largest and most respected UK tree nurseries, looking at the range of tree species and their potential to deliver flood mitigation, cooling, and carbon capture services in a garden situation. So our focus is really on species and cultivars which would be suitable for an average UK garden. And we know that trees can do an awful lot of good, but garden owners tend to be very weary and worried about putting trees in the gardens, especially if they have a smaller garden. So we're trying to see how we can help them make more informed choices, and also deliver promises which are actually holding, as it were. So that we don't overpromise, or they get too excited, and we know those things are not possible with the trees of particular size or stature. This was mainly just some highlights from our outdoor research, and admittedly probably 85% of what we do focuses on outdoor planting and garden planting. But over the last few years, we have also had some interest and supported some indoor research around indoor air quality and focusing on carbon dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, and relative humidity on various, literally from chamber scale to office scale. But also more recently, preferences for plant shapes and well-being. Actually, just today, RHS released a press release, so there is some press interest today. If you're a Telegraph reader, there will have been an article on my student Jenny Berger's paper that looks at preferences for houseplant shapes and people's perception of air quality and their own well-being. So basically what people like and how it makes them feel. So the summary of those several papers that I've listed in the previous slide, which have been done by in collaboration with universities of Reading and Birmingham, is we've worked on 8 species in various combinations, in various experiments, leaf, chambers, room scale experiments. So we played with all sorts of things. And then from that work, we found that really, if you want to get any benefits in terms of indoor air quality, in terms of individual potted plants, light levels need to be right. And they aren't in most indoor spaces. So that's a real limitation. So we mustn't be over-promising on what plants can do. Generally, large plant numbers are required for any CO2 or relative humidity impacts on the office scale, but we can be more positive about the plants' role in NO2 removal. They do remove relatively little, but the little that they do remove can be significant because that's a very harmful chemical. So kind of there's good news and bad news. And then in terms of this preference research, we found that the homeowners and space users preferred rounded plant contours, that the plants that they perceived as beautiful and interesting had positive impact on their perception of air quality. So if people thought that the plant looks good, they thought it did well for air quality as well, even if it didn't, and that it also positively affected their well-being. There is obviously quite a lot of detail there, and full paper is available for those of you who are interested. So on that note, Prashant, I am going to just thank my many colleagues who have helped us over this period from the universities of Reading, predominantly, also colleagues from other departments in the RHS, colleagues at the University of Sheffield and University of Birmingham. Yes, and I'm happy to take some questions online or, as they arise, and I will stop sharing.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tijana. This was very interesting presentation. And I think it was really good to see the work of the plants, not only outdoors, but also indoors. So that's an area where a lot of people are interested in. I'm sure that the colleagues might have some questions for you, which we'll pick up later on. We can possibly move on to our second talk that is given by Dr. Netsanet Mebrate. So he brings over 17 years of both academic and commercial experience within a drainage design software. Having completed a PhD in scientific computation, Nat is involved in Flow's strategic roadmap at Causeway, conducts both technical and market research, and builds the training and support capability for Flow. So today, Nat will present how to harmonize the different opportunities and challenges that impact the development of sites and the communities who live within it using sustainable drainage systems. Very interesting, Nat. So we are looking forward to your presentation. Over to you now.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the nice introduction. And hopefully you'll be able to see my screen as well. So it is interesting because Tijana was talking about plants and their importance in rainfall attenuation, rainfall management, etc. So what I thought I'll discuss today is what most of you are familiar with, which is drainage. But it will be interesting to see how many of you are knowledgeable in terms of the detail and the nuances that are involved in terms of drainage. So hopefully you'll be able to see the comparison between the traditional approach and the more sustainable approach that has been in effect across the UK for a while. So the main agenda for today is to look at what has been the challenges so far globally as well as in the UK, and essentially what drives the transition from the traditional approach to a more sustainable approach in terms of drainage, because obviously the first thing that comes to mind when you think about drainage is to get rid of it and not to remember it. But obviously you need to think about the detail and understand what needs to be involved. So we look at what type of challenges are involved and the drivers and the philosophy behind the emergence of sustainable drainage system when it comes to dealing with drainage. And we look at the benefits and the challenges of the sustainable drainage system on its own, and we'll obviously summarize and find out hopefully what is involved in terms of the traditional and the sustainable drainage system approach in the UK. So before I go into the more detailed explanation, I'd like to point out that when it comes to drainage, the first thing pretty much everyone thinks about is it is something that is dirty, that's going to be buried in the ground and basically something to be hidden. But if you open your mind up and if you think about actually a more sustainable and a more effective approach to dealing with drainage systems, that is something hopefully that will be able to give you a good understanding of what needs to be done. So in terms of the challenges that are involved and what has been driving the development and the emergence of the sustainable drainage system, the traditional approach to drainage, as mentioned, is basically something that means you just need to get rid of it. You need to remove the drainage out of the impermeable areas, out of the towns, out of the cities as quick as possible, primarily led by the concern about sanitation and also really to make sure the maintenance is something that is going to be effectively dealt with, because if you bury stuff under the ground, maintenance is going to be difficult for someone to go in and maintain. So most of the design basically is to deal with a long-term sustainable approach, is something that basically will come into picture. But if you bury it underground, it's very hard to access. So when you design the traditional drainage systems, you just make sure the self-cleanse and sediment build-up, etc., is not some part of the story. So that was the main, that's the main approach. But with sustainable drainage system, essentially the idea is you are able to obviously deal with not only the volume and how quickly things are going to run off when you turn sites into impermeable site, but also you are looking at managing multiple benefits that sustainable drainage systems can bring you, because you could have plants in it, as Tijana was saying. It allows you to be able to attenuate and be able to manage the rainfall more sustainably. It also allows you to have a more biodiverse environment, as well as amenity-wise, looks-wise, as Tijana was mentioning. When you have plants, it actually enhances the amenity aspect. So that is essentially what the main crux of the differences are. But in terms of the driver, you see, in terms of drainage, all we think about is we're going to have water that's going to land on a site. If we don't deal with it properly, it's going to flood, either where the water lands or where the water courses are, so where it eventually will run off and overwhelm the system downstream. So if that is the case, then what is the best approach to get rid of this issue with flooding that is going to happen when you have rainfall? So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is when it comes to the environmental aspect, because many of the rainfall that lands on your site, on impermeable areas, the built environment, basically collects a lot of pollutants from cars and litters and animal waste, etc. And that pollutant is going to be, it's going to get washed, and it's going to eventually end up into water courses, rivers, creeks, etc. So that kind of diffuse pollutants are very difficult to deal with. So that's something that is currently a challenge with traditional drainage system. We'll look at what sustainable drainage system allows us to be able to do when it comes to that. But in terms of flooding, obviously both traditional and sustainable should be able to deal with the flooding that happens, but there is also slight differences in how both approach, and we'll look at that. And also the traditional drainage approach tends to be all underground. It tends to be basically looking at just one benefit only, to deal with the water quantity, amount of water that lands. Whereas when you think about traditional drainage system, as I said, there's multiple benefits that it can deliver, and that's something to look at. So biodiversity and amenity becomes part of the equation. So in terms of the philosophy that drove the traditional approach to be changed into a more sustainable drainage approach, the main aspect of it is essentially to mimic nature, to look at what nature intended, and to try to approach designing a drainage similar to what nature intended. So what that means technically is to do three things, which we will have a look at a bit later. So the main aspect, though, is the source control aspect, which is basically to say, as the rainfall lands on your site, you need to make sure that rainfall is going to be dealt with at the source. So that essentially means to try to make sure that you provide all these components that basically allow sustainable drainage to be part of the equation. So you design swales and trenches and rain gardens and bioretentions as part of the drainage system, instead of just having a pipe system. So what that allows you to do is, if there was the soil allowed infiltration, most of the water normally will sink into the ground and gets lost through infiltration. There will be evaporation and evapotranspiration if you have plants, etc. So you end up basically controlling the water at the source. Even with traditional drainage systems, the approach has been that because obviously when you get a lot of rainfall that lands on your site that runs off eventually, and that runoff is going to be a lot quicker because obviously you turned an permeable site to impermeable, meaning obviously you paved or you kind of like built a roof, etc. So that basically makes the water run off very quickly. And also, when you have when you have nature, obviously it soaks the water into the soil. You have evaporation, transpiration. So a lot of losses is going to be generated. So the water that's eventually going to run off and get to the water courses is going to be a lot more minimal. So when you turn a site to impermeable, all that losses is not going to be available. So it's going to quickly run off and it's going to generate a lot more volume. So that is eventually going to end up into the water courses, overwhelming the system downstream. Even natural systems like rivers and creeks, etc., you see them flooding. And that has been obviously something hopefully you have observed, through the news, etc. So the idea is if you try to mimic nature, so meaning you allow the infiltration to be similar to what nature intended. Therefore, when you design drainage system, you just don't build them underground, you bury them and forget about them, but you actually build plants and build bioretentions and then maybe conveyance that basically similar to swales and ponds and bioretention, etc., that allow the water to be conveyed while obviously the residence of the water within the structure is going to be elongated, and it allows the water to be soaked, and it allows the water to evaporate and transpire, etc. So gets lost from the system. So the amount of water that's going to run off is going to be reduced, and also the volume that's going to be generated is going to be reduced. So that allows you to manage both aspects of the volume equation when it comes to drainage, what the traditional drainage system has not been able to do. So it allows you to manage the volume and the runoff rate or the flow rate more effectively. It also allows you to obviously have benefits when it comes to pollutant removal and bioretention, things like water quality aspect. It allows you to improve the amenity aspect. It allows you to be able to improve the biodiversity aspect. So technically, the benefits you get is multiple. Therefore, the traditional approach has been pretty much selected as the best approach, and it has been promoted across the UK to be one of the things that needs to be pushed. And that is something hopefully you will see in the couple of slides that is going to appear in the future in the next slides. So from the legislation, regulation, guidance aspect, the philosophy and the driver for sustainable drainage system is mainly the Flood and Water Management Act, which passed through Parliament in 2010 as a result of a lot of flooding that was experienced in the UK pre-2010 that basically meant the government commissioned the report that basically found out the best approach to mitigate flooding through fluvial and pluvial, meaning through river and runoffs, etc. That has been the main reason why most of the flooding was happening in the UK, is to control the water from the source. So technically, the recommendation is use sustainable drainage system to make sure that the flooding that happens is going to be minimized. So that was part of what is called the Schedule 3 Act. And the Schedule 3 within the Flood and Water Management Act has been completely implemented within Wales. But in England, there is essentially what is called the Lead Local Flood Authority, which is responsible in delivering local flood risk management. So, they can recommend sustainable drainage systems to be part of your design as well when you deliver a design, which is part of essentially the local planning that is delivered. So any development will have, as you know, planning system that basically allows you to be either approved or not, and that basically becomes part of that equation when that delivery happens. Also, you have to consider climate change, because the prediction and the suggestion in the future is greater vulnerability in terms of the weather pattern. And the suggestion is we will have a lot warmer summer and wetter winters, which is likely to lead to greater runoff. So the more runoff you get, obviously the more flooding you're going to get. So you have to think about what you design currently so that it can be able to mitigate the kind of climate change impact that is going to happen in the future. There are multiple other drivers such as the building regulation, etc., that basically enforces sustainable energy systems to be part of the development. So in terms of principle, the philosophy and principle are very similar, except obviously in terms of delivery, as I said, the main aspect is management train, source control, and subcatchment. So the management train basically uses a sequence of sustainable energy systems or components of sustainable energy systems. If you look at a very small site like a roof, one roof, for example, what you are looking at is designing something like a line soakaway, house soakaway, etc., to deal with the water. If you have a couple of houses, then you can have one or two sustainable systems, like a pond or something like that. Then if you have very large development, then you can integrate essentially large networks of sustainable systems that allow you to manage the water. And that basically means it will be able to deal with the water quality, quantity, amenity, and biodiversity aspect at the same time. So source control is the first and main parcel of sustainable system because it allows you to manage water closer to the source. They say that's the reason why it's called source control. So as it lands, you are basically providing sustainable systems to deal with that type of rainfall. The management train basically looks at moving component. So like the source control first, that basically controls the water from the source. And then you have things like regional control, etc., and a site control that basically allows you to be able to essentially have a chain of command, more or less, to deal with rainfall allowance on your site. The self-catchment control provides you the opportunity to manage runoff in a cost-effective manner and basically enables pollutants, etc., to be dealt with effectively as well. So the benefits of sustainable systems, as you can see, is mainly the four major ones. The water quantity, which has been really the main driver for all the traditional drainage system. But when it comes to sustainable drainage system, the idea is like to balance the four into effect. So it's not only the quantity you have to deal with, which basically leads to flooding, etc. You also have to deal with the water quantity aspect, the amenity, and biodiversity benefits that sustainable system brings you. So typically, sustainable system focuses on delivering benefits in terms of how much volume that's going to be generated and the reduction of the volume that you're going to get. And in terms of water quality, amenity, biodiversity is kind of like forgotten. So by managing the flow and the volume effectively, and at the same time providing the water quality, amenity, biodiversity benefits, sustainable system is obviously head and shoulder above the traditional approach. But one of the things worth mentioning here is even with the traditional approach, obviously most of the runoff that's going to end up is normally restricted because obviously if you just let the water run off effectively, freely, it's going to overwhelm the system downstream. So the traditional approach always recognized there needs to be limitation at the source in terms of how much runoff was generated. But it didn't really take into consideration the volume that also gets involved in terms of how much volume is going to be generated from the site. So that is one of the things that basically allows you to manage the volume, the runoff, as well as the pollutant removal, the biodiversity benefits that you get, and amenity benefit that you get out of designing something like a drainage system that is more sustainable and adaptable for the future climate change, and is able to provide you a better place to live in and engage with the local community. As part of any design anyone makes, actually within the UK, there is some recognition that there is going to be climate change, there's going to be an effect of the increase of rainfall, an increase of what is called urban creep, because people are going to continue to increase the footprint of impermeable sites, etc. So all that needs to be taken into consideration when you do design of a drainage system. So essentially the challenges, the existing challenges in terms of drainage design, in sustainable drainage system design, I should say, is to do with who is going to adopt it and who's going to take the ownership to be able to maintain the sustainable drainage systems. Typically, sustainable drainage systems tend to be a lot more cost effective because they are on the surface, easier to maintain, easier to have access to, and also obviously because it will enhance the amenity and biodiversity aspect of any development. It actually obviously raises the perception of value, etc. So it does have that benefit, but when it comes to who owns the maintenance aspect, who is going to essentially maintain and adopt those types of sustainable systems, there is a question mark still. So there isn't a clear set guide that basically means whenever you do a development, even though it might be cost effective, it might be beneficial for the environment and beneficial for the society, it might not technically translate directly to be effectively something that is going to be designed automatically unless there is some kind of clarity on who's going to adopt and maintain it. There is also obviously misunderstanding about what constitutes a sustainable system, and there might be also a problem in terms of understanding by the community that live around the sustainable systems, because it doesn't look like a drainage, it looks like just part of the landscape. So that is something that requires more education, because it might end up getting paved or getting blocked if it is porous paving. If you have some kind of landscape, you might think, oh, I might actually pave that and park my car on it, etc. So it's worth raising awareness with the community. And in terms of retrofitting, it is a bit challenging because it tends to take land. So if you have a new development, it is effectively something you can integrate as part of the public open space you're going to have as part of the development, so that actually can be easy to integrate into when you design. Whereas when it comes to retrofitting, the availability of land, which is essentially something that is premium, is something that might be a challenge when it comes to adoption of sustainable systems. And also large-scale planning that has been done across the cities in the UK and outside basically never had that kind of consideration to drainage systems. So obviously the linkage between the micro scale, source scale, site scale to large scale city-wide, town-wide planning needs to be a lot more integrated to deliver obviously sustainable systems in the future. And it's not as simple to be able to deliver the multiple benefits unless you understand exactly what is entailed with the design aspect of drainage systems. So this is something that could be of a challenge in the future. So to sum up quickly, the main benefits of drainage design when it comes to traditional to sustainable, as you saw, is pretty much very wide, right? So it's very clear, pretty much if you design sustainable systems, it allows multiple benefits to be attained. So it's a no-brainer, but the challenges are still there. So in trying to be able to control the water from the source, in being able to essentially deal with the rainfall that lands on the site as quickly as possible within the site itself, and eventually cascading that to deal with the larger site control and regional control, etc., will allow you to mitigate flooding and allow you to mitigate pollutant removal and pollutions and effectively deal with essentially giving you a more greener site and a lot more biodiverse environment. It also means the standardized system gives you a flexible concept, a flexible approach to design, but it is a lot more complex and a lot more difficult to be able to design or to deal with. Therefore, this is something that needs to be balanced in terms of educating the engineers that are going to go and design this, and at the same time allow the multiple benefits to be attained by doing design that is going to provide multiple benefits to the community and the developers that basically will probably commission that type of work. So the constraints are there, but at the same time, the drivers are there as well. So it allows you to be able to essentially deliver something that is more sustainable. It allows you to be able to deliver something that is more long-term, that allows climate change factors to be considered, that allows flooding that might technically be a big problem in the future, be dealt with at this early stage, and allow you to be able to also provide all the benefits I talked about. So that is mainly what I wanted to discuss, and I think it gives me a couple of minutes before we finish. So that is something that hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for question and answer.
Yeah, thank you very much in that very exciting presentation. So I think I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Thomas, who is also the co-investigator on the Reclaim Network, to chair the session on the question answers. So over to you, Thomas.
Thank you, Prashant. Thank you to both presenters, and thank you to everyone who have already submitted questions via different routes. So we have a lot of questions, probably more than we have time for. So a lot of interest in both. So some of them have come in via the Q&A. Some of them already have some answers to them, but I will probably ask the presenters to elaborate a bit more on them anyway. One of the questions I thought was very good was from an anonymous source who asked Tijana, how many plants would you need in your office to make a noticeable difference to the air quality in your office?
So yes, it would depend on this typical scientist. It depends. Depends on the size of the office, depends on how many people, depends on how much light there is. It depends which compound, how you grow those plants, how big the plants are inherently. So yeah, there's a lot of ifs, but generally the more the merrier. From our own studies for CO2 and relative humidity impacts for a normal university kind of, box type office, which is, 10 square meters, you need minimum of 6 before you can measure any differences. And that's even when everything's really, if you're in a sealed box, if somebody's opening doors and windows, then everything, that overrides anything that plants do. And that's why I think it's really important not to, be too hung about, even outside, it's like, oh my God, it's doing this. It's doing multiple things. So it's doing very little. The plant itself is doing very little for the gas exchange. And that's predominantly because light levels are low. But if you can if you can put it in the window, if you can have some lights on it, if you can have a green painting, there are certain installations now called green paintings or like active green walls where you can stick more things in. That's fine. So then, and we haven't even looked at the particles, and some studies show it's less for the particles, but they can also have an effect. We know that actually for NO2, you need very little, you need very few, but actually a lot of the action is in the substrate. So it's better to have them in soil, that's not soil, but the growing substrate rather than soilless or in the hydroponically. So yeah, you can see I'm opening a whole can of worms, but I would say really the more that you have, the bigger the impact will be. But equally, then there's this well-being productivity effect. One of the studies that I've listed there, we've done just it was a master's project, a small study which we've published, where we took some in a real office building, 2019, it was pre-pandemic, brought some plants in people's offices and then took them away. Complete rebellion. Building manager, was spoken to and asked to replace the plants when we've left. So, it's really multifaceted. It's not just about one thing they do or they don't do. It's about the cumulative effect and then looking after. The study that Jenny's just published is also shown you need to look after them. That's the problem with plants. So if you have plants and they are awful, actually people are stressed out and they don't like them, and so they probably are worse than not having any at all. So, you know, it's swings and roundabouts.
Thank you. Obviously, much more complex question than the.
Yes, I'm sorry. You probably wanted to say, yeah, put 3. Well, if
Yeah.
you don't want to kill, you know, like non-killable ones are Zamio, Sansevieria. Probably most things, if you put it in self-watering pots, would also be fine. So then see how much your office can take, and, you know, stuff it with stuff.
Yeah, sounds like good advice to me.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the next question. So Najam Siddiqui has submitted a question to Net. In fact, I think there's 3 questions in one question. So I'm just going to take the first bit of it. So the question is, regarding SuDS, is the cost of implementing them in a residential area, such as, for instance, swales and rain gardens, etc., justified with everything else, say, for example, carbon footprints, etc.? Can we justify doing this?
Very good question, and I think it has been costed, and it has definitely been justified compared to at least traditional drainage system. It is head and shoulder more cost effective in terms of carbon cost, and also just the traditional cost that's involved in making them. So yeah, that research has been done, and it has conclusively shown that tends to be what happens when it comes to costing the design of sustainable systems. But one of the things I can say is, like, the main reason why you don't see them quite a lot is because when it comes to building them, it actually takes land, right? So the land take aspect is actually the issue. So, you know, a developer will probably assume that land is probably best suited to build a house on it instead of a sustainable system. But if you have public open space as part of the site development, that is a no-brainer. And you'll notice if you have a larger development, it tends to be what is being used, what is being designed currently. So most new developments that involve larger site tends to have sustainable system as part of the design. But yeah, carbon costs, the traditional cost, etc., is just effectively head and shoulder above the traditional drainage, just because you know, making traditional drainage system is actually very expensive, and you know, you need to dig and you need to build all these plastic pipes or concrete pipes or clay pipes or whatever, and transport them, etc. Whereas, you know, with sustainable system, you're actually effectively using the landscape to be part of your design. So it is a lot more cheaper and effective from both aspects.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I'm sure there are real constraints to implementing what looks at the surface to be a really good idea. So I think this is a very interesting aspect. So thanks for that. So we'll take another question for Tijana. So this is from Helen McIntyre. So it's really interesting. So plants that have high potential evapotranspiration rates are better for providing cooling and flood management ecosystem services. How drought resilient are they? Would they be able to survive in a 2050 climate and beyond, I guess?
Yes, it was very excellent question, and I've just typed up speedily an answer to a very similar question from somebody else. Yeah, no, absolutely true. And somebody else was asking me, oh, okay, so the soil's drying, and you said transpiration is important. Will they, you know, they will cool less? And yes, they will cool less as soon as the soil dries. So the trick there, and it is again a complex one, I'm afraid, which is why we really need people who understand plants. You know, so I always know when I lecture at the RHS, because I lecture at the University of Reading and also RHS training programs, and we need people like RHS trainees who actually know plants inside out. So it's really about finding the plants that you can push to the maximum. So there are, you know, in the vast availability of, you know, plant world, diversity of plant world, those species, you know, there are plants that would, excuse me for using flower show type language. I mean, I can get more scientific, but I don't know who my audience is. There are plants who would keel over at the first sign of stress. They would shut their stomata and you lose the service from them. There are plants that are a bit more resilient, that will be pumping, and then they drop. So it's finding the ones that will go for longer in the periods of stress, and there are such examples in the plant world. also knowing when they will kill over and when you need to intervene with sustainable irrigation, because there's absolutely, there isn't a plant that will keep going and providing the service in completely unfavorable conditions. And so some of our research was also at looking, sustainable water sources to prolong the periods when they are, providing this transpirational cooling. In the UK climate currently, it's still possible to use collected rainwater for long periods in the year and use that to supplement when, in the periods of drought stress. There are also periods when you can use grey water, and we have done some experiments. There are species that can withstand quite long periods of being irrigated with grey water. That's the water from kitchen sinks and washing, not from toilets. But again, it's not as simple as, we've solved the problem, let's just keep pouring our soapy water onto plants, because there are different plants, some of which would take quite a lot of watering with soapy, salty water, with different conductivity, and that also changes plant function. And if you water with grey water, you can also shut down the stomata after a period, but there are plants that can withstand it for periods of weeks, and you'd hope by then some rain will fall. So again, I'm sorry that I'm not giving you straightforward answers. This is the species, but there are horticultural solutions, but you need this plant knowledge and soil knowledge of what would take what and how you can combine that with some engineering solutions and some top up, because you will need, in order for them to cool, you need to supplement irrigation in long periods of drought.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we're actually rapidly running out of time. We have many more questions than we can possibly answer here. And I think we could probably have a prolonged discussion about the dual role of plants, both as flood management and air pollution. But with 30 seconds left, I feel that this is possibly a bit much to ask our presenters to give opinions on, even though I'm sure they do have them. So with that, I think I will draw the question and answer session to a close. Thank you to everybody who submitted questions. I know some of them have been answered online. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but such is the time constraint. So thank you, everybody, and I'll hand you back to Prashant to finish off the meeting.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think they were very interesting presentations, both of them. So looking into the plants indoors and outdoors, and then a very kind of the holistic perspective, what they could do to the SuDS as well. So I believe that that's basically what we want from these webinars, to look more holistically how the green infrastructure, the blue infrastructure could be embedded into the urban areas. So I can take this as an opportunity to announce our next webinar. So that is going to be on 6th of July, at the same time. As you can see that there are two very interesting presentations. The one is talking about the deep paving in Paris region, literally making a space for nature. So so very tempting. So I'll encourage all of you to join again, the next one. And then the second one will be on the technology-enabled social prescribing and gamification approaches to link communities to local green spaces. So here you can see a touch of the IoT and the computing, and then bringing it together with the with the green spaces. So that's basically is the last slide. But before we close, so I would like to thank all our speakers and our chair and all of you to join this session. So just to say, which I missed the opportunity in the very beginning, that Reclaim Network Plus is one of the 3 networks which were funded by the UKRI jointly by 3 councils, which is the EPSRC, AHRC, and NERC. And we have a team of 5, the co-investigators into it. So myself, and you heard from Thomas, and we got another colleague here today, Dr. Niria Calavilla Gonzalez. So she's from University of Warwick. And then the other 2 colleagues who could not make today come from University of Bangor, Dr. Sheila Malam, and UKCH, which is Professor Lawrence Jones. So you can contact us on using this email address, which is the info@reclaimnetwork.org. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter to know the latest updates. We will be launching some calls, in near future. So one of them is related to the webinar speakers. So if you are interested or you know somebody who could contribute to this and can share this knowledge across the colleagues, then I think we'll be very interested to hear from you. Apart from that, we will have a call on the secondments, which will be an opportunity for the early career researchers, including PhDs, to go and work with the interdisciplinary teams, which could allow them to exploit some of those benefits, which usually we are not possibly considering them when we are looking at one aspect of the research. So with that, I would like to thank everyone again and look forward to seeing you in the next webinar. But just to add one last thing, that this webinar is recorded and will be available at our Reclaim Network YouTube channel. So you can see it later on in case if you missed it, or if there are colleagues actually who wanted to look at it later on. Yeah, with that, thank you everyone again. Bye.
Thank you.